Hi everyone, I'm Jeff Lawton. I'm going to look at a game from the Candidates Tournament taking place at the moment in Ekaterinburg in Russia. And it's from the fifth round, played today between two of the co-leaders, Ian Nepomniatchi and Wang Hao. So we can see them here. They're in the shared lead on 2.5, along with Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, the French player, who was sort of very late entrant because Radjabov dropped out at the last moment. And MVL is black against Alexienko, which was a really interesting game, actually worth checking out. Mainline Najdorf. So in this game, Jan opened with e4. We have e5, knight f3, knight f6, Petrov's defense. Knight takes e5, d6, knight back to f3. So this is main line. Knight takes e4, d4, d5, bishop to d3, and now sort of slightly unusual development. Usually you see this knight developing or the bishop f5, castles for white, bishop to e7, and rook e1, and black castles. So we've got a sort of, this is unmistakably looks like a Petrov, or maybe it could come from a French exchange or somehow, but white's got a slight lead in development, so he sort of, tries to use that, but it's usually, it's very minuscule indeed, these sort of advantages. Knight d2 to challenge the well-placed knight. So we have knight to d6, knight f1, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3. So we're still following known theory, c6, and bishop to f4, developing the bishop. So white's development's a little bit easier than black's. And we have knight a6, and now h4, which is, according to Jan, it was a theoretical novelty. So of course we can't capture that because black drops his knight. So Wang carried on developing, ready to bring the knight around, or simply to go queen e7 and rook e8. That's why he's played his knight there rather than to d7. And now we had knight g5, so he's posing a problem to black. How are you going to stop the mate? So either got a choice of this really, or taking the knight. So Wang Hao decided to play bishop g5, bishop takes g5, and now f6. You sort of more or less got to play f6, because if you play queen c7, then the rook comes in with gain of tempo, which would be very bad for black. So we had f6, but now he's slightly weakened this square, and that also makes it a bit harder for black to play g6, because then he's got two pawns moved in front of his king, which is never ideal. So because g6 is also more difficult to play, white can try and maneuver his knight to a nice square f5. So we had bishop to f4, queen d7. So black's really close to equalizing, because he's about to swap some pieces off. That's how the Petrov goes. He's sort of just playing to equalize really in a lot of these sort of positions. And now knight g3, rook a to e8. And now sort of quite surprising bishop d6, but the idea is to, well, we'll see that in a moment, queen d6, and now knight f5. So the knight occupies a strong square. So Wang Hao played his queen back to d7, sort of keeping an eye on the king's side. And it is indeed a better move than queen f4, because then after g3, queen g4, king g2 was sort of forcing the queen back to h5, and it's sort of in no man's land a bit here. And this would give white a good position. So we had queen d7, queen h3, which is ready for knight h6 check. If you capture, then the queen falls. So Wang got out of the way of that with king h8, and now h5, sort of increasing white's sort of grip around the black king a little bit. Even so, black can trade, rook e1, and now we had rook e8. And all the rooks come off the board, rook e8, knight e8. So anything that white has got here is really a tiny advantage, but it's based on the strong knight here. And you know, like I say, the pawn on h5 hopes to cramp the black king. So Nepomniatchi played g4 to free his queen for action rather than keep defending the knight. We had a6 and now b3, which Nepo criticised after the game and said that king f1 was a better move to sort of control these two squares, stop black's queen coming down here, and then one idea was to use the queen to come to a3 at some later stage in some lines. But we had b3, queen to e6, and now the knight dropped back to e3 to stop the queen invading, and also supporting the break with c4. We had knight d6, bringing the knight onto a much better square, and now h6. So although it's a difficult pawn to tolerate on h6, on the other hand, after Wang's reply, it could become weak. Pawn on h6 because the knight can attack it with knight f7. All depends really where white's queen is going to be. But certainly white doesn't feel like black doesn't feel like allowing his pawns to be broken up. So we have g6 and now c4. We have d takes c4, b takes c4, and now king g8. So the first thing to look at is, well, what if black was to capture that? Well, straight away, because of the strong pawn here, we can sort of see some lines where this is hugely to white's advantage. We go knight takes c4, queen c4, and now queen h2. We've got to be a little bit careful for white not to play here, because then queen c1 is check, and then we can take, because we're forking the king and the pawn, so that wouldn't work. But sort of rather elegant one square move, you know, with the queen, just makes a really sort of pleasing effect somehow. So the queen immediately is threatening to come in there, and black's checks are no good. I'd love to be able to play the queen to d1 check, king g2 takes here, but from c4 you can't do that, and queen c1 doesn't help, just doesn't do anything at all because the queen is protecting that, and then white's going to play queen b8 next move. So if, for example, we can look at either a queen move or a king move. You've got to do one or the other to stop queen b8 mate. If you try queen f7, we've got queen b8 check, forces queen g8, and then queen to d6, and now the threat is queen f6 forcing mate. So that would force queen f7, but we can force mate anyway with queen d8, queen g6, g8, only move, queen f6 check, queen g7, and mate. Sort of quite an elegant line somehow that black's just simply can't do anything because of the power of the pawn on h6. And we also had knight c4, queen c4, queen h2. We can also look at if the black king escapes from the net instead, the sort of mating net. Then we have queen b8, king f7, queen takes b7. Now, one problem is you can't protect h7, of course, because queen g7 is mate. So the king must abandon the pawn. For example, king e8, we can play queen h7. Again, black can't do any useful checks because he can't play the move he wants to play to d1. You know, queen c1, simply king here, and white's threatening queen g2, queen g6 rather. That's just hopeless for black. And if instead you try the king and pawn endgame with queen f7, white can trade off and then just bring his king in. For example, if g5, this is easily winning for white, king e4, king h6, king f5, and the white king invades. For example, king g7, king e6, king g6. Now we simply take this off, and f5 doesn't help. f3 takes on g4, takes on g4, king f6, king c6, and the d pawn will stroll through. So knight c4 isn't possible. But a better defense probably is to play sort of a bit of a passive move, but knight f7. I think it might give better defensive chances. Maybe because it puts pressure on this, and so it ties white's queen down a bit. Obviously it's not so easy to swing the queen into action now, because you can simply take that pawn off. But in the game we had king to g8, and now queen h2. So now we had king f7. We still can't take that, because when we play knight takes, queen takes, and queen b8, transposing back to the line we just looked at. And now we had c5. So white's going to try and invade with the queen. And all the time this is difficult here for black. But it's all very close margins, this. It depends on the concrete lines whether white can make anything of this, because as I said, it can turn out to be weak in an endgame with, say, just a knight endgame, unless white's managed to come and take the b7 pawn off. So we had knight b5, and now the queen invades on b8. And now we had queen d7. Now this is probably the losing move, or it's definitely the losing move. It's hard to see why, really, but a better defense is queen e7. And then if white continues as in the game with queen h8, then after king e6 to defend with the queen, now defending h7, and then after, say, f4, we have knight d4, queen g8 check, king d7, and now king f2. And now white can't make anything of this, really, because black can just play knight back to e6, and this is nothing like as good as the game. Okay, you can still try and kick the knight away, but white simply isn't achieving anything. Gf5, gf5, and black can take. So white couldn't be so play so adventurously as just to give the pawns up, because there's no breakthrough going on over here. But after the game moved queen d7, we had the same line with queen h8, king e6, and now f4. So now the threat is to play f5, and we can't play queen d4, which runs into queen e8. Unfortunately, with this checkmate, the pawn's covering that escape square, and the knight's covering the d5 escape square. So we had knight takes d4, and now queen g8 check. So again, king e7 runs into queen takes h7 when the pawn on h6 is very strong, and this knight does a very good job of defending the king from the opponent's queen. So we had queen f7. Now the queen's gone a bit passive, and we had queen c8 check, queen d7. So again, repeated moves, just gaining time on the clock. And now we had queen d8 this time. So the immediate threat here is to play queen to d6, and in fact there's no way out of this for black but to give up a piece. So well, like I say, because if you play knight b5 to prevent queen here, then white can simply play a4, which wins a piece, because the knight, for example, can't go here, just to demonstrate its checkmate. So queen d7 was played by Wang Hao, because that's the only move. And then we had f5 check, gf5, gf5, knight takes f5, which is forced not to lose the queen. And we had queen d7, king d7, knight takes f5, and then we had king e6. So now this, may not be that simple to win for white. Black's king is much nearer to the pawns than white's, but Nepo played the very accurate move, knight e3, and, well, to sort of, most of our surprise, Wang Hao resigned this position, but just to show that it's not it is a completely lost position. I'll just give a few lines here. But say Black plays King F7 to come and take the H pawn, then we can play King F2, King G6, and now Knight G4 protecting the pawn. If you move your king to here, then White simply advances, and that's similar to what we're going to look at. And notice also that these 3v2 don't. It's not really a typical 3v2 because these two pawns, or this pawn in particular rather, is keeping these two held back. So over on that side of the board, White doesn't mind at all that he's got a pawn less, and so although it's 2 pawns for the piece, it's a little bit like having 1 for the piece in a way. So in this position, we can play Knight G4, protecting that, and then after F5, now Knight E3, and now, well, Black's got a choice really. Either he plays F4 or he plays King H6 straight away. So I'll just demonstrate both lines. Let's look at King H6 first. Then we would have Knight F5 check, King G5, and now White goes pawn hunting on the queen side. And slightly surprising, he can do this and still win the game even without the king being more active. After A5, we can play A4, fixing that pawn. And then King F4, for example, Knight B7, King E5, Knight takes A5, King D5, Knight B3. Now we're threatening to push the A pawn straight through to queen. And if you play King C4, then A5, King back. But now Black king can't do anything, and White can just come and pick off the H pawn and then bring the king all the way to the queen side, and the king can finish the job off. So instead of F4, sorry, let's just check that out again. If we play King F7, King F2, King G6, Knight G4, F5, Knight E3. So instead of King H6, if we try the move F4, which is the second line I was going to demonstrate, then we have Knight G4 protecting H6, and this is now pretty easy for White, because Black can't wander over to here, because then we can play Knight F6 and take that, and then it's the queen, the H pawn queens. So you'd have to play something like King G5, King F3, A5, A4, King A4, and now we can remaneuver the knight back to F2. Black has to come after the H pawn again. King G5, Knight E4. Now if you play King F5, we're back into similar lines to before. Knight D6 and takes. But notice also in that line, Black hasn't even taken the H pawn, so it's even worse. And after King H6, White can just really ignore the F pawn and go straight after the queen's side bounty. King G5, Knight B7, King F5, Knight A5. And then after King E6, Knight B3, we're back into similar lines to before. King D7, King takes F4, and it's very much like what we just looked at. Black hasn't managed to stop White getting a passed pawn, and this king easily takes care of the one black passed pawn. So, although slightly early resignation, it does look fully justified. So, as a result of that, Ian Nepomniatchi now goes into the lead, sole lead, first person to be in sole lead in this tournament after 5 of the 14 rounds. He's on 3.5 out of 5, and MVL drew very complicated Najdorf against Alexienko, and Grisha Kunding drew a game where Grisha had a very slight edge, but Ding defended accurately, and Anish had a fantastic position actually against Caruana, but Caruana hung on and was perhaps quite fortunate to get a draw. So thank you for watching that. I hope you enjoyed that demonstration of that game. Thanks for watching. Bye now.